right. Hello, everyone. We're going to keep talking about the French Revolution. Today, your learning targets: what changes did the radical government make in French society and politics? What was the Reign of Terror and how did it end? Today, it's important that you take notes on this presentation. These two questions are two of the questions you'll be asked at the end of this presentation. Some of the slides have some of the information, but not all of the information that I'll be discussing today. Here we go. A radical government here. Although everyone in the new National Convention supported the revolution, they were divided into three political factions. The groups were called the Mountain, whose members were called Montagnards. These were the most radical. Many Montagnards also belonged into the radical Jacobin club, or the Jacobins. The Montagnards' support came from lower middle class and poor people. This support pushed the Montagnards to adopt more radical policies. A second political faction, the Girondins, were moderates. They came mainly from the provinces and resented what they considered the excessive influence of the Paris mob on the revolution. The Girondins generally supported a constitutional monarchy and resisted extremes on either side. The third political faction, the Plain, was made up of the swing voters. In general, the members of the Plain originally supported the Girondins, but later switched their support to the Mountain. These groupings had no formal organization. They did not put forth programs or promote plans of action. Each member acted as an individual and was often strongly influenced by personal rivalries. The three prominent figures of the Mountain. Jean-Paul Marat, a radical, was in favor of violent methods. He was one of the National Convention's most radical leaders. In this photo, you can see the depiction of him getting murdered by Charlotte Corday, who hated the radicals. She set out on what she saw as a patriotic mission. Believing that only Jean-Paul Marat's death would save France's republic, the young woman made her way to Marat's home in Paris. A member of the National Convention, Marat was a leader of the radicals who had taken over the French government. Because he was suffering from a severe skin disease, he had taken to working at home while soaking in the bathtub. At Marat's home, Corday said that she had information about traitors. She was taken to Marat, who sat partially covered by a table across his tub. As the two talked, Corday slowly reached into a fold of her dress. Suddenly, she pulled out a large kitchen knife, leaned over, and plunged the blade into Marat's chest. Blood gushed from the wound, and Marat sank slowly into the water. The radical leader's skin disease gave an enemy the chance to destroy him. With his murder, Marat became a martyr to his followers. Georges Jacques Danton had been violent in the early days of the revolution, but favored compromise and was popular with the people. Maximilien Robespierre was known for his intense dedication to the revolution. He became increasingly radical and led the National Convention during its most bloodthirsty time. Shortly after the National Convention convened, the king was placed on trial. But the Girondins had hoped to avoid a trial, but they were in the minority. The more powerful Montagnards were eager to try and execute the king in order to prevent a return of the monarchy and to defend the revolution from its enemies. Quickly condemned, the king was scheduled to die the next day, January 21st, 1793. That morning, the Paris streets were quiet. Soldiers lined the way to the place of execution in case any supporters of the monarchy caused trouble. At the scaffold, Louis began to deliver a speech proclaiming his innocence, but a drum roll drowned out his voice. He was pushed into place on the guillotine, a device that dropped a sharp, heavy blade through the victim's neck. When the deed was done, a young guard held up the dripping head for all to see. Reports of the king's execution quickly spread across Europe. Outside of France, Europeans reacted with horror to the news of the French Revolution. The London Times newspaper condemned the revolution and execution of the king as savagery. After the king's execution, the National Convention began to tighten its hold on France. First, it set up the Committee of Public Safety to manage the country's military defense against the foreign forces on France's border. The committee promptly created an unprecedented draft of all able-bodied, unmarried men between 18 and 45 for military service. In addition, the National Convention established a court called the Revolutionary Tribunal. This court was supposed to root out and eliminate people who threatened the revolution from within. The revolution not only transformed the French government, but also attempted to completely transform French society. The leaders of the new government wanted to erase all connections to old ways of life, including religion. Many clergy members lost their positions. In Paris, the local government closed the churches. To replace Roman Catholicism, Robespierre created the cult of the Supreme Being, in which enthusiasm for the revolution was the object of worship. Anti-clerical feelings took many forms. Even statues of people holding Bibles were not safe. Workers changed the titles on the Bibles to read Declarations of the Rights of Man. A metric system replaced the old system of weights and measures. A new calendar also cut ties to the past. The months were renamed, and every month had 3 weeks and 10 days. 3 weeks of 10 days. The revolutionary calendar fell out of use, but the metric system was one change that was kept. By the middle of 1793, many people were concerned about the course of the revolution. Many of the French themselves were criticizing it. Outside France, the countries of Great Britain, Holland, Spain, Austria, and Prussia were worried enough about the revolution to form a coalition and make war against France. As a result, some of the revolutionary leaders feared that they would lose control. They decided to take drastic actions to avoid a possible counter-revolution, a revolution against a government that was established by a revolution. The Mountain began a series of accusations, trials, and executions that became known as the Reign of Terror, creating a wave of fear throughout the country. In France, real resistance to the revolution lay in the countryside. Shortly after the peasants won their main goal, the end of feudal dues, they returned to their essentially conservative views. In general, they remained devoutly Catholic and opposed the revolution's anti-clerical moves. When the National Convention instituted a draft, the peasants' hatred for the government erupted. Village rebels declared, "They have killed our king, chased away our priest, sold the goods of our church, eaten everything we have, and now they want to take our bodies. No, they shall not have them." In a region of Western France called the Vendée, resistance to the government was so strong that it led to a civil war. A counter-revolutionary force called the Catholic and Royal Army, a name showing support for the Roman Catholic Church, and the monarchy fought government forces. Savage fighting spread across the region. The government eventually regained control of the Vendée, destroying everyone and everything it could. Back in Paris, the Mountain, the leaders of the campaign to eliminate any resistance to the revolution, used the Revolutionary Tribunal to rid the country of dissent. Robespierre declared the need to use terror to defend the Republic from its many enemies. The Revolutionary Tribunal started its campaign with the Girondists, who were seen as a threat to the revolution because they had once favored a constitutional monarchy. Soon, anyone who had ever criticized the revolution or who had had any connection to the old order was in danger of being hauled in for a trial. Some people were tried merely because they were suspected of counter-revolutionary activity. The accused had few rights, and some were even forbidden to defend themselves. The most common sentence was death by guillotine. Such a death was quick, in contrast to the agonizing methods of execution in use for centuries. To get to the scaffold where the guillotine waited, the condemned rode in an open cart that paraded through the streets of Paris. Crowds gathered along the cart's route to jeer at, or sometimes cheer for the passengers. At the scaffold, mobs watched the gruesome executions. Women with radical sympathies sometimes sat near the scaffold and quietly knitted while the victims went to their deaths. The guillotine was so efficient that the executioner could execute more than one person per minute. Executions became so common in Paris that residents complained about blood overflowing the city's drainage ditches. The Reign of Terror did not spare any particular class, occupation, or gender. Though many more common people than nobles were killed, the nobility were not entirely spared. The peasants and laborers, the same people the revolution was supposed to aid, formed the largest group of victims. Nor did the terror spare women. Marie Antoinette was one of the early victims, as were many women of the lower classes. Olympe de Gouges, who wrote the Declaration of the Rights of Woman, and the female citizen also went to the guillotine. Even the nuns who refused to close their convents were also sent to the guillotine. Those who launched the Reign of Terror eventually fell victims themselves. Robespierre sent Danton and his followers to the guillotine for suggesting that the rule of terror might be relaxed. Then Robespierre himself became a victim. On July 27, 1794, Robespierre and his supporters were surrounded by National Convention soldiers and taken into custody. Soon after their arrest, the heads of Robespierre and about 100 of his supporters fell into the guillotine's basket, where so many heads had fallen before. How many victims to the Reign of Terror? Some 300,000 people were arrested, and about 17,000 were executed. Even though the dead were a small percentage of France's population, the widespread violence shocked the French and increased foreign opposition of the revolution. The actions of the Reign of Terror were intended to protect the revolution, but had in fact weakened it. As one woman shouted as she went to her death, "O liberty, what crimes are committed in your name?" After the terror, France had to start over with a new government. In 1795, the National Convention wrote yet another constitution. It restricted voting rights given in the previous constitution. Now, only men who owned property could vote. After the new constitution was adopted, voters elected a governing board. Called the Directory, this governing board was made up of 5 men called directors. The directors did pass some financial reforms that helped farmers and improved trade. But the Directory was not an effective government. Partly because the directors were weak and corrupt, France's troubles continued. The directors argued amongst themselves, failing to lead the exhausted country forward. Eventually, their rule shared many characteristics of the old orders: high prices, bankruptcy, citizen unrest. The result was a power vacuum. With no one really in control, something in France had to change. Now, let's look back at our daily learning targets. Please answer these 2 questions and then check the Google Classroom for your next assignment.